Hey everyone, this is a pretty unique video that I'm making today. It's the first one in about a year's time that I'm doing something completely unscripted. And so basically what happened was I spent the week off of regular uploads reading all 400 pages of Kevin Rudd's The Avoidable War, and let me tell you, it is a remarkable read. And so basically for most of this video, I'm just going to be pitching to you why you should read this book and do something of a review, although it won't be a particularly critical review. Before we do that though, I actually want to tell you where we're going with our channel for this next little bit. Essentially, when it comes to the history of China, which is what I think most of you guys are subscribed to the channel for, I've done 3 series in the year and a half that I've had this YouTube channel. The first series was a broad history of modern China that went from the end of the Chinese Civil War up until the present day with Xi Jinping. The second series was a specific history of the US-China relationship, mainly from 1972 all the way up until the present day. And then thirdly, as we started the new year, I spent the first third of this year looking at the different characters in communist China. Now, there are more to explore, but I think I want to bring it back to less character-driven history and spend some time actually thinking about the big questions that people have surrounding the history of communist China. And so our next series that we're going to be doing is called Questions of Communist China, and we're going to be answering some pretty big questions that are there around the historiography of China, but perhaps ones that you haven't really thought of before. Now, I've got a list right in front of me, but this isn't an exhaustive list, and I would love to have any of your questions added to it. So some of the videos I plan on making are why Deng Xiaoping's reforms were not capitalism, how the Cultural Revolution changed the course of Chinese history forever, what's fairer to say, Mao Zedong won the Civil War or Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War, how China saved North Korea in the Korean War, and what happened after the Great Leap Forward. And there's also a chance for some topical history too, such as China versus East Turkestan, which the modern day Uyghur Muslims are kind of descended from. And then what was the Sino-Vietnamese War that happened in 1979? So there's a few different questions that we have here, but this isn't an exhaustive list at all. And I would love to know if you had any questions surrounding communist China that you'd love to see a video made on. Leave it in the comment section below or shoot me an email. I'd love to do a video on one of those topics. But now let's look at someone who has a much cleverer and, let's be real, a much sharper understanding of China than I do, Kevin Rudd. Now, if you're not Australian here, there's a decent chance you won't know who he is. Every Australian subscriber that I have will know who Kevin Rudd is, and that's because he was our Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, and then was briefly back in 2013, but that was purely to save some seats going into an election. He was never going to win that one. Perhaps the other way that non-Australians might know who Kevin Rudd was he's got a pretty big TED Talk on YouTube regarding the US-China relationship. I'm going to be honest, I actually don't think that TED Talk is great. I think he speaks in big, broad brushstrokes and doesn't actually get into the specific detail at all. And that's not his fault, it's just by virtue of speaking to a pretty generic audience. You guys would have a much more detailed understanding of his audience, and so if you watch that TED Talk, he's probably not saying anything that you haven't heard of before. However, he has an incredible mind, and this book is incredible. It's 400 pages of detailed analysis on the Sino-US relationship, but there is more emphasis on China. And Kevin Rudd is writing this with the assumption that we know nothing about China, and so his explanations are really clear, even for someone who's a bit of a novice at Chinese history. And this isn't the same thing as, say, Barack Obama writing a book about China. Kevin Rudd was a diplomat to China throughout the 1980s, he speaks fluent Mandarin, and he actually served as foreign minister for quite a long while, so he's got an incredible understanding of China. He also has a think tank called the Asia Society Policy Institute, and when he studied at university, he actually studied Chinese history and he's got a degree in history. So he's more than just a politician giving his 2 cents. And so he actually begins this book by providing a history of the US-China relationship, and it's basically Mr. Mitchell History, the book, except he does it probably a fair bit better than I do it. So essentially, he goes back a little bit earlier from when I started my series, but he goes back to the 1800s and he writes a history of how the US-China relationship developed. And he actually spends a bit of time emphasizing things like the open door policy and the impact that American missionaries had on China in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So it's a really good commentary on the US-China relationship, and it goes back a little bit earlier than what you can find on this channel. It's also interesting, one of the things I really liked about this part of the book was because he was a diplomat and a prime minister and a foreign minister, he actually had a lot of quite interesting anecdotes to share on these characters of communist China that we've looked at. So when it comes to Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, we portray them on this channel as quite robotic because we don't really look at their personalities per se, we mostly look at their policies. And so it actually humanizes these guys quite a fair bit. When you read Kevin Rudd's stories and he's taking Jiang Zemin through the opera house and you see Jiang Zemin trying to sing opera, it's really interesting anecdotes that Kevin Rudd has to share about these people that actually just makes for a really more interesting story. And so to actually get to know these people in the same way that we have a familiarity with, say, Trump or Obama or Clinton, it's really interesting to read Kevin Rudd's anecdotes around these guys. So the first bit is a history of the US-China relationship, and then Kevin Rudd moves into what he calls the 10 concentric circles surrounding Xi Jinping. Basically, what are Xi Jinping's top 10 policy priorities and how is he going to go about achieving them? Now, some of these I'll go into more detail than others, but at the end of the day, like I keep on saying, get the book, see what Kevin has to say for himself, because he says it way better than I'm going to paraphrase here. Now, the first circle that Kevin Rudd looks at is Xi Jinping centralizing power under himself. There's a few things that we look at. We look a little bit at the anti-corruption campaign, but Kevin Rudd actually introduces some new points that I haven't really covered on the channel so far. One of those is Xi Jinping's education policies, and Kevin Rudd talks about the banning of private tuition. Now, this serves two purposes. Firstly, it gives Xi closer control over education, and because it's all concentrated into the schools, he can have a much more decisive say as to what's being taught in the Chinese education system. But secondly, China's facing a huge population crisis, and Xi Jinping is really worried about population rates declining. One of the reasons why people don't want to have children is the expensive tuition fees that have just become a normal part of Chinese culture. And so as part of alleviating the parents' financial burden, Xi Jinping said, no private tuition, school is where you go to learn and be taught. And so there are a few other things that Kevin Rudd explored in this chapter, such as Xi Jinping's control over religion, both for Muslims and for Protestant churches too. He also spends a fair amount of time looking at how Xi Jinping has ramped up the nationalism in China, which is actually interesting because Marxist-Leninism is very heavily anti-nationalist. The second of Xi Jinping's policy initiatives that Kevin Rudd looks at is regarding national unity. Basically, where are the pockets of instability surrounding China? And so he looks at the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, he obviously looks at Tibet, he looks at Taiwan, which you can't ignore right now, and he also looks at Hong Kong as well, and how that has changed since 2019. I won't add any analysis of my own, it's an interesting chapter, and he talks about the different, I suppose, challenges that Xi Jinping is facing from within. The third chapter that Kevin Rudd looks at is probably the toughest chapter in the book. It's regarding economic prosperity, and what does Xi Jinping have to do to keep the Chinese people happy regarding the economy. Kevin Rudd makes it clear, Xi Jinping's primary concern is not economic prosperity. That for him is less of an important concern. The reason why the economy is of some concern to Xi Jinping is because he needs it to get the Chinese people to go along with what he's doing. Chinese people have seen their quality of living dramatically improve in the last 30 years, and in order for Xi to achieve all of his policy initiatives, that needs to be continuing to improve, otherwise they're going to want to go back to someone who made them rich. And so the chapter explores some growth goals, such as equal GDP per capita with America by 2049, but Kevin Rudd also spends a fair amount of time looking at how President Xi actually wants to create a more equitable economy, and in that way he's much more conventionally Marxist-Leninist. He also talks about some of the cultural reforms that Xi is trying to make a more productive economy. So he talks about the 3-hour per week gaming ban that's put upon teenagers to avoid them becoming hedonistic consumers and productive members of society. And this part of the book is pretty detailed, and there was a fair amount that went straight over my head. He uses a lot of data, and he talks about things like the 2015 market crisis and then different challenges China has faced since COVID. But the big picture that Kevin Rudd was getting at during this chapter was that Xi Jinping has his hands on the economy more, and Xi Jinping is less focused with private growth than what previous Chinese presidents have been. And so the fourth circle that Kevin Rudd looked at was Xi Jinping's approach to the environment. Now, this is a short chapter, but at the same time it's pretty interesting. Now, he begins the chapter by basically saying, unlike previous Chinese presidents, Xi Jinping was the first to really care about the environment. As part of the performance review of CCP provincial bosses, it was previously just economic growth. That has now been changed to add reduction in pollution too. And so economic benchmarks were used to evaluate the performance of Chinese provincial bosses. Now, Kevin Rudd doesn't argue that China has suddenly become a saint when it comes to the environment, and in fact, he actually points out China's current reliance on coal. An interesting stat that he mentioned in the book that I didn't know of was that China is currently producing more coal plants than exist in the USA in its entirety. And so the chapter talks about the environmental issues that China is still facing, but he also does talk about the political advantages for acting on climate change. So he talks about China's promise to be carbon neutral by 2060, and at the same time, he talks about Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Accord back in 2017 and how that allowed a vacuum for China to step in and take global leadership. And so he also talks about the political advantages that have come for China with being an environmental leader. And so the fifth circle that Kevin Rudd looks at is probably the one that you'd find the most interesting. It's the modernization of the military. Now, unlike most history teachers, I don't have a huge interest in military history. So when Kevin Rudd talks about the space PX-500, Mace Windu rockets or whatever they are, I don't really have much of an idea what he's talking about. There's a lot of conversation around the different technologies that China's invested in, and for me, I just don't really know that area very well. So I'll declare early on, I'm not heaps up to date when it comes to that sort of stuff. However, there are some other interesting things when it comes to the politics behind the army. The first one is that Xi Jinping wants to purge a lot of the PLA, and he has done so, particularly on anti-corruption charges. So he's gotten rid of a lot of the old guard from the PLA. The second thing was that Xi Jinping wants to have his army have more battle training. And so there's a lot of naval exercises that China is doing in the South China Sea to give them the closest thing to military warfare training that they can get. The PLA hasn't faced many major wars since 1949, whereas the American army has had heaps of battles to fight in. The other interesting thing is that he talks about how China is trying to build up its navy rather than its army. Previously, China has been mostly concerned with defending its territory, mainly from within, because you've got Tibet and Xinjiang on the west, and you've got Mongolia and Russia in the north. And so a lot of what the PLA had tried to do previously was focus on its territorial protection. Instead, Xi Jinping has sought to build up the navy so they can be a little bit more expansionist and a little bit more aggressive. The next 3 chapters were the ones that I found most interesting and the ones that were page turners for me. So firstly, chapter 6 talks about the relationship with all the neighbors China has. So it talks about China's relationship with Russia, with India, with Japan, and with North and South Korea. That's a really fascinating one. For me, what was of particular interest was chapter 7, when Kevin Rudd talks about the Quad. Now, being an Australian, obviously I resonated with this chapter a lot. And so in this chapter, he talks about the American counter-alliance that they've made to combat China. So if you don't know, the Quad is India, China, Japan, and America, and basically it's an anti-China alliance that was there. Interestingly, in his chapter, he talks about China's response to the Quad, mainly crippling Australia. So back in 2020, China effectively boycotted a whole bunch of our exports, and it really damaged our mining and our wine and our fishery industry. Now, the thinking behind it was which of the Quad partners is easiest to target, and obviously out of India, Japan, America, and Australia, we're the easiest to target. And this was basically a message to the outside world saying if you align against us with America, it will economically devastate you. The 8th circle that Kevin Rudd talks about in this book is the Belt and Road Initiative, and you can see our video on it here. Effectively, in this chapter, what Kevin Rudd does is he talks about all the different countries involved. What I found most interesting was his commentary on the Taliban. So Rudd wrote this book at the beginning of 2022 and probably started at the end of 2021, which was freshly after the Taliban invaded Afghanistan and reclaimed control. And so Rudd's argument here is that China is offering the China-Pakistan economic corridor to Afghanistan as a way of getting the Taliban to give them Afghan resources. He also raises a pretty interesting point about Israel. One of the points he raises about Israel here is that China's trying to use the Belt and Road in Israel in order to get Israel to give them American technology. Israel is one of the most technologically advanced armies in the world, and so Rudd is saying that China's offering Israel a lot of Belt and Road infrastructure in order to get access to some of that key technology. Another argument that Rudd makes that is interesting is he does not believe that China is intentionally debt-trapping nations. For Rudd, the economic risk is way too high, and whatever political capital you can gain from countries unable to repay their debts is not worth the economic risk and debt that China would go into. The 9th circle that Rudd discusses is a pretty broad one. It's what's China doing with Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Now, the thing that I found most interesting on this chapter, I'm just going to talk about one thing here, was when Kevin Rudd talked about the Arctic, and I hadn't considered this at all. Effectively, Rudd's argument here was that with climate change, the Arctic Circle is now providing 30% of the world's natural gas reserves, and China worked really hard to get themselves onto the Arctic Council. The other important climate change factor regarding the Arctic was it actually opens up a new shipping route, which is the Northeast Passage. Now, the Northeast Passage is 8,000 kilometers shorter, which provides a whole bunch of cost advantages. The other important thing about the Northeast Passage opening up is that it allows a route that avoids US choke points by completely avoiding the Indian Ocean. The final circle of concern for Xi Jinping that Kevin Rudd talks about is how does China navigate a rules-based order that was created by the USA? So after World War II, the USA led the world in creating a new body of international law. You have the United Nations, you've got the World Bank, and so forth. Now, effectively, China wasn't there when those systems were being made. Well, technically, Chiang Kai-shek was there, but not the Communist Party and not what China views as legitimate Chinese leadership. And so how does China navigate those rules that they didn't write and that was actually created by their direct competitor? And so there's a fair amount going on in this chapter. I think what I found particularly interesting was that China is leveraging its UN veto vote to get a lot of Africa on side. And what Rudd said was that if China was to become the new world superpower and create a new rules-based order for the world, it would still heavily regulate trade and have rules surrounding trade, but there would obviously be much less emphasis on having a liberal democracy. And so after Rudd discusses these 10 circles of interest for Xi Jinping, he then turns his attention towards potential scenarios for how a global war could break out between China and America. There's some really interesting ones. Obviously, he starts with Taiwan and what an invasion of Taiwan would look like. He talks about the potential for an accidental collision in the South China Sea between a US vessel and a Chinese vessel and how that could trigger a war. He speaks about the possibility of there being no fight and China occupying Taiwan without any resistance. He talks about a potential for a conflict with the East China Sea and Japan and how that could bring America in. He talks about the potential for a cyber attack, either done against Taiwan or done against Japan or done against America. And he actually talks about the small chance of there being a Taiwanese insurrection. He freely admits that a lot of this is based on conjecture and gaming simulations, but it is interesting to explore these different possibilities. Finally, the book concludes with Kevin Rudd's solution to the issue, which is strategic competition. So Rudd's main thesis of the book is here's the issues, here's how we can avoid a global war that would be catastrophic. And I want to just read out this quote that Kevin Rudd says. He says, "History tends not to believe in limited wars. Instead, history tells us that wars are far more likely to escalate out of control. By contrast, kicking the can down the road creates political space that over time can accommodate changing diplomatic sentiment that in turn may be capable of bringing about a long-term peaceful resolution to the all-encompassing strategic competition currently engulfing these two great powers of the 21st century. Such a resolution may currently be beyond our political capacity to imagine, but it may become possible with the passage of time." And so for Rudd, kicking the can down the road in terms of delaying a global war is completely fine, and he says that's not an issue at all and shouldn't be seen as a counter-argument. For Rudd, if you can delay a global war from happening, that allows for things to change in between. If a Taiwanese invasion is scheduled for 2035 rather than 2030, that's not a policy loss for Rudd, because that allows time to help in between. And so for Rudd's idea of strategic competition, if the leaders want to avoid war, he suggests this. They get together, they agree to a set of principles that neither of them are going to be completely happy with, but will delay war from happening. And so Rudd's suggestion is that Taiwan remains as is, so the status quo of Taiwan remains as is, and the invasion of Taiwan does not happen for this next decade. In return, America has to pull out all of its high-level officials from Taiwan. A lot of them were in place when Trump came to power. So Rudd's suggestion is the status quo is maintained. Neither party is going to be completely happy with that because America wants to fortify Taiwan while China wants to take Taiwan, but it is the best path of avoiding war. Another suggestion of Rudd's is to do with the Philippines. And basically his suggestion is to get America to come to an agreement with China where China leave the Philippines alone and don't have any territorial run-ins with the Philippines. Now you might be saying that sounds heavily pro-America, but it is in China's best interest if China wants to avoid a war too. And so Rudd suggests the US get China to agree to have no territorial run-ins with the Philippines, with each side being able to police and monitor each other as they go about achieving a whole bunch of different aims that Rudd discusses in these books. The two examples that I gave probably sound more heavily pro-America than pro-China. There are some counterexamples that Rudd gives in the book that would be seen as more pro-China than more pro-America. Anyway, the book is a terrific read. Most people who have some sort of interest in the US-China relationship would be able to understand most of what Rudd is saying, and I highly recommend you read it. Stay tuned for next week where we're going to have our first Questions of Communist China episode, and we can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.